All right, everybody, welcome back to the FITSNews studio, another edition of your Week in Review. I'm Will Folks, the owner, founding editor of this media outlet, the host for the show. A lot to get to, starting with the Appalachian apocalypse. It's devastation in western North Carolina from Hurricane Helene. Our Andy Fancher spent 48 hours in the mountains of western North Carolina. He's going to walk you through everything he saw and how he arrived at a conservative death toll that has nonetheless drawn extensive response and rebuke on social media. Andy's going to walk you through all of those details. I'm also going to sit down with Jen Wood to go through what was a missing person case. It has turned into a murder investigation involving a wannabe Charles Manson up in the upstate of South Carolina. We're going to tell you about the story of Jessica Barnes and the charges filed against her husband, Brandon Barnes, and two others involved allegedly in her murder. Finally, we are less than a month away from the 2024 presidential election. Dylan Nolan and I are going to sit down, go through all the latest numbers in the swing states, and talk about what the two major campaigns need to do to drive the winning margin in those pivotal battleground states. All of that and more is heading your way on the Week in Review. So obviously we're starting this week with the biggest story in the country, one of the biggest storms ever to hit this country, Hurricane Helene. After making landfall in the Big Bend region of Florida on September 26, this storm cut a swath through the Panhandle, through Georgia, a glancing blow to South Carolina, but did most of its damage in western North Carolina, an area already inundated by rain, suffered a devastating deluge from this storm, causing landslides, mass flooding, and death beyond measure in the mountains of western North Carolina. Now, how many are dead? How many are missing? If you follow conventional media, mainstream press, you would see some very conservative, very small estimates, numbers that from folks on the ground are nowhere near consistent with the reality of this storm. A lot of folks have blamed misinformation. A lot of folks have, including the governor of North Carolina, blamed X and blamed Elon Musk and others for sowing disinformation. In fact, Governor Cooper referred to a vortex of misinformation that he claimed was damaging the people of western North Carolina as they tried to recover. Well, one of the things I've learned in this business, folks, is that in not every case, but a lot of cases, the people citing misinformation are often the ones doing the misinforming. So what we wanted to do, which what journalists are supposed to do, is go there ourselves, see with our own eyes, talk to people who experienced this storm, and hear what they had to say about the true number of dead, the true number of missing, and the real damage that has been done to the Appalachian country. I'm joined now by Andy Fancher. Andy, this past week you had the privilege to go up to Appalachia to visit some of these areas that have been impacted by this unprecedented storm, at least in terms of the damage that was done up there. Tell me what you saw.
A mass casualty event. There's no other way to put this lightly. There is no way to downplay what we're dealing with here. We saw boxes and boxes of body bags. We heard testimonies upon testimonies upon testimonies indicating that we're dealing with thousands of people dead, which is why I put a conservative number out there, which is that we're dealing with perhaps 500 people dead. That was the number I was solely able to confirm, which is concerning, considering that I went to North Carolina with no sources, no Rolodex, and returned in 48 hours with a definitive number from at least one outpost. After this trip, I'm hesitant to call myself a journalist, considering all the other journalists that were present and should have seen the same things I saw, should have heard the same things I heard, and should have smelled the same things I smelled.
Well, let me ask you this question. You talked about the 500 number. You talked about the 1,500 number missing. That's an estimate. That's actually not just from your sources on the ground up there. That's something the Hurricane Helene People Finder website, they've got that similar number.
Correct.
And you know, when you came back with these estimates, I was skeptical. I actually reached out to some of my sources that are close to the federal response. This can't be right, can it? And the response I got back was, yes, 100%. So whatever you're hearing on the ground is what the feds are hearing as well. But here's my question. Why aren't they telling people this actual size of death, the actual scope of this tragedy?
Sure, let's look at the 5 W's, right? The 5 W's of journalism. Who, what, when, where, why. Why, why, why?
Mhm.
Why is nobody talking about the evidence that's right in front of them in Western North Carolina alone?
You even showed on one of the stories you wrote this week, or one of your social media posts. In fact, we'll pull it up here. This Wikipedia actually scaling back
We've
the
seen,
estimates
yes,
of
by
death.
some miracle, 8 resurrections in the wake of Hurricane Helene. From Florida to North Carolina, the official number, as of this recording, from Florida to North Carolina is about 232. Yet, according to first responders out that way, dozens of first responders, they're finding dead by the hundreds.
Mhm. You said something a minute ago. What you hear, what you see, what you smell. What's what's that?
I was not awake to the totality of what's happened in Western North Carolina until a first responder who I was shadowing, although not a first responder in the most traditional sense, took me to Lake Lure. It was the dead of night. We were granted permission to go past the police barricades to the point where we were the only vehicle in what remains of downtown, and there ain't much left. He pulled his pickup truck over a bridge in which the broad river was running underneath, and what his headlights could see were just splinters of houses, of businesses, of people's entire lives, entire communities smashed up against both sides of this cleared bridge. He put the truck in park over the bridge and he rolled down every window in the truck. And at that point, a foreign smell that I had never encountered before flooded the cabin of his vehicle. And he looked over at me and he said, "That's death."
Oh, wow.
And it wasn't until then that my eyes were starting to open a little bit.
And they haven't even started digging under all that detritus to get to.
Later in the day, I was shown a photograph, an aerial photograph of that bridge that we were at. And according to the individual who took this picture, there were bodies floating in
Mm.
the debris.
I want to give you a chance to push back a little bit because there was somebody that one of these social media commenters, and I hate to give idiots too much oxygen, but this one person has said, "Oh, this is all hearsay." But the people that you met, the people that you talked to, these are people who had actually seen these stacks of bodies. They'd seen this number. You didn't pull it out of your ass. These are the people who saw these bodies telling you that they'd seen them.
People who have had to handle individuals they've grown up with, having to load members of their own family onto a trailer. You can see the heaviness in their eyes. The people who have seen it, who have dealt with this, will carry this weight for years. Just the odor alone from Lake Lure has stuck with me,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't even see a body.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, you talk about the people there, some of the people that you met that are engaged in this just this unfathomable rescue recovery effort. Tell us about some of those people.
Good people, resourceful people, trustworthy people, people who have lost everything and are still willing to give you the shirt off their back. In Swania, we encountered a man who had lost everything: his car, his 3-bedroom house, the first property he was ever able to call his own, and he was cracking jokes with us. In fact, me and my ride noted that we were thirsty, and he asked us if we wanted water. You know, the only thing this man asked for was mustard. That's Appalachia.
So these towns you visited, several of them, and I remember looking at some of these pictures, you would talk to these first responders as they pointed, oh, we got one here that you showed me. They pulled what, two people out of this house. And that, but as you toured these places, they would tell you, yeah, we pulled two bodies out of here. We pulled 3 bodies out of here. There's a family of however many.
11.
Yeah.
11 in Fairview alone reportedly dead. Now, of course, these are not confirmed. These are not coming from official sources, as the official sources are few and far between out there anyway. I mean, this is neighbor, helping neighbor, recovering neighbor, discovering what's left of neighbor. So that's why the number we put out was a conservative estimate. If we count up the general numbers that were provided to me by people that have purportedly handled those individuals, we're already up into the thousands. That's why I played it so safe by publishing a number 2 times greater than what MSM is putting out on the entire fatality count from Helene.
All 4, yeah. All
And here's
4
how we
states.
got that number. As there is rightful concern over whether or not 500 was confirmed. Here's how we got it. 2 officials, who I cannot name. In fact, I must emphasize how much everybody who's talking to me is risking by going against the mainstream narrative, by indirectly calling the governor, calling the feds liars, which they are, at least based off the testimony that I'm going to share with you right now. There were 2 officials traumatically familiar with Helene's deluge in western North Carolina, and they were having a conversation via phone, and they were discussing a number of fatalities reported at but one lone outpost. Once I was provided this number, which is a receipt, by the way, which is a receipt, even then I wasn't convinced. I was still a victim of mainstream media. So I started calling around, as you know, a normal journalist would do, especially one present. I started calling around to people I knew, to people I didn't, cold calling official sources, and what I presented to them was a very simple question. Listen, I've got a number before me. Can you tell me whether or not my finger's on the pulse or if I'm way off? Granted, not everybody wanted to participate, and rightfully so. Who would want to talk to some journalist cold calling asking about hundreds of fatalities? But those who did participate, those who are also traumatically familiar with what's going on out there, overwhelming response. And the overwhelming response is, that number's low. That's why we put out 500.
So the reaction, though, to this, and I do want to point out 500, I think, Andy, I think that's an incredibly conservative estimate, and I think you reached it based on, again, those direct conversations with these people directly impacted, directly handling these bodies. I think your missing number similarly very low. But when you published this piece, it was interesting. Social media didn't like it very much, did they?
So much so that they removed it. Not once, but twice. The censorship industrial complex is alive and well in the wake of Hurricane Helene. I posted our conservative 500 number, buddied with a quote from a volunteer helping with the rescue efforts out that way, who noted that he saw body bags stacked 5 feet high and 35 feet deep in Fairview alone. And Facebook removed that post. They didn't cite me for misinformation, though, because it's not inaccurate, don't you know? They cited me for spam, said my post was misleading. And I looked at the analytics afterwards. It was one of my top click posts ever. So I did a follow-up post on Facebook, noting that Facebook has removed one of my posts. Not an inaccurate statement. That did just happen, and they removed that as well. I don't even remember what they cited. I was too pissed off to see. So finally, after going back to the drawing board, all I did say, and as it remains on Facebook now, is, listen, y'all, they're removing everything I'm saying about Hurricane Helene. So here's 10 pictures from Buncombe County.
Yeah.
Now, as for Twitter, Some of my most clicked tweets right now are relating to my post getting removed from Facebook. It is reassuring to see so many people waking up to the fact that maybe, just maybe, we're being lied to.
Well, there are a couple reasons that I think your numbers are not only going to hold up as far as being accurate on the lowball side, but if we look at where these bodies are, a lot of them are in very inaccessible places, places that people haven't even gotten to yet. So there's that. A lot of these bodies have been buried under rubble, under mud. It's going to take a long time to get to a lot of them. They're finding new bodies every day up there. I had one of my federal friends talk about two of her workers. One stepped on a wrist, one stepped on a thigh, just pulling them out of just stacks of splinters, as you said. So, but then the other thing, communication for notifying next of kin is non-existent. The chain of custody on these bodies has been difficult to establish, given some of people literally wash from one county to the next, one town, far afield of the town. I mean, just
Well, and something the first responders out there noted as well is some of the difficulties they're encountering is figuring out whether the mutilated remains up in a tree are that of an animal or that of a human.
yeah.
And you're right, talking about the inaccessible areas, radio, communication blackouts, which it still is. Hell, when we were traveling through Asheville, through various corners of Appalachia, you realized very quickly that people don't know what they don't know. When you don't have a house, when you don't have a car, the last thing you're worried about is, I wonder what MSM is saying about the official death toll.
Yeah.
And when we delivered those official numbers to people out that way who have been without communication for, now 2 weeks, they're appalled. They're shocked.
When you hit on it. We talked about the inaccessibility. We talked about these bodies being buried under debris. We talked about chain of custody. We talked about all that, but you just hit on it. A lot of these bodies, and we hate to be morbid and,
I mean, that's what it is.
I mean,
That's what
they're
it is.
not
This
in
is a mass
condi-
casualty
yeah,
event.
they're not in condition to be identified.
Right.
Some of them. So yeah. Wow. Well, Andy, you're going back too. So we'll hopefully get some updated numbers from there. But I just want everybody to know, as we cover these storms, as we cover these stories, whether we're talking about meteorological developments when these storms are first formed, whether we're talking about the fallout, and in this case, the apocalyptic fallout from the storms when they strike. I want you to know, count on us to go there ourselves, to see it with our own eyes, to talk to the people who are on the ground, to hear their testimonies as Andy's been doing, and to bring you our best conception of the truth. And Andy, I want to commend you not for a couple things. Number one, for going up there and digging and finding these numbers that nobody else is reporting. But also, I want to commend you for standing your ground, getting all the heat you've been getting from this post. I couldn't believe it, frankly. I didn't think this was that controversial. When I first, the story you put out, and I'm like, when federal sources are confirming, I'm like, hey, this is low ball. Nobody's going to be mad about this, but everybody losing their minds over it. People coming after you. I just credit to you for not only the work you've done, but how you stood up and defended it. So I'm joined now by our intrepid industrious researcher, Jen Wood, who has been tracking a missing person story out of the South Carolina upstate. Although this week, the story went from a missing person investigation to a murder investigation. I'm talking about the case of 20-year-old Jessica Barnes from Pendleton, South Carolina. Jessica was first reported missing on August the 2nd of this year, and just this past week, human remains found near a boat ramp off of Lake Hartwell, 4 miles away from the pool house where she was living with her husband and 2 other women. Those remains conclusively identified as belonging to the late Jessica Barnes. Jen Wood, this story of Brandon Barnes, the husband of Jessica, who just days before her remains were discovered, or conclusively identified rather, was professing his love for her. He's now been charged with strangling her, and then with these 2 accomplices, these 2 women that were living in the home doing unimaginable things in an effort to conceal this crime. Jen, walk us through this wannabe Manson up in the...
Yeah, this story is just like nothing I've ever heard. Jessica Barnes, the last time her family saw her was in late July. And at that point, her mother said that she was kind of getting fed up of the living situation, living with Brandon and these two women. Apparently, they had her doing all the cleaning. She was taking care of Kendall Mim's baby. But she went back, and the last time anybody saw her alive was August 1st. Cecilia Favera, Jessica's mother, said that, in August, even after police say that she was murdered, she was receiving texts from Jessica. So, she apparently, Brandon or one of the girls was texting Cecilia as Jessica from her number. So Cecilia didn't think there was anything wrong. But on August 22nd, 26th, which was Cecilia's birthday, when Jessica didn't call, she had some red flags go up and started asking, trying to call her, trying to, ask the people she was living with where she was, asking Brandon where she was, and she was not getting any answer. And the answers she was getting were very inconsistent. So on September 10th, she went to Pendleton Police Department and reported Jessica missing, which started the investigation.
Okay, so at that point, it's been 40 days roughly since she was last seen, Jen Wood, and you're telling me that her mom had received these text messages, but had recognized some inconsistencies. I think you had said, sometimes they were spelling the word mama differently. Like her daughter would say mama spelled it M-A-M-A, and they were spelling it
Right.
differently. And she's like, wait a minute, those were the kind of red flags she was seeing. But Jen, we've heard some disturbing reports, and again, I don't want to get too graphic here, but obviously the investigators and those who investigated this case referred to remains being found. They did not refer to a body being found, and that's part and parcel to an alleged effort to conceal this crime. We're informed, if the allegations are accurate. What can you tell us, Jen, about what is alleged to have happened to Jessica Barnes after her murder?
Yeah, so Jessica's husband, Brandon Barnes, was charged with murder on October 2nd. Police, after executing a search warrant on the pool house where the four were living, as well as a search warrant in Pickens County at a boat ramp near Lake Hartwell, um, they, continued their investigation. They found what it turned out to be Jessica's remains at the boat ramp. Once those remains were identified by a forensic odontologist. They charged Brandon Barnes with murder, and the two women living with him, Kendall Mims and Victoria Tippett, they're both 20 years old, with accessory after the fact, obstruction of justice, and misprision of a felony.
And I know we don't want to get into too much about what happened after Jessica Barnes was murdered, and how this next phase of this crime was allegedly accomplished. But Jen, I did notice there you said remains, not body, and I also noted that you referred to this forensic specialist making the identification, which would certainly lead those watching to believe that this was not an intact body that was recovered there by the shores of Lake Hartwell, about 4 miles west of where this pool house was located. But Jen, I want to try to untangle, if we can, this web of of uh, of women that this Brandon Barnes had spun. Obviously, he's married to Jessica. They were about to have a child earlier, prior to her death, but that child was a stillborn child, and there are allegations related to that. Am I not mistaken?
Yeah, so according to Jessica's mother, Jessica lost the baby in March, almost full term. And it was, according to her, related to abuse that she sustained at the hands of Brandon
Oh
Barnes.
my
There
gosh.
was an investigation into the baby's death, but ultimately no charges were filed related to that.
And Jim, we've also seen pictures of Jessica Barnes, that abuse, evidence of alleged abuse again at Brandon Barnes' hands. Are there other abuse allegations against this individual?
Yeah, so I did see images of Jessica. Her mother showed me, and the injuries that were shown in the photos were horrific. Very sad, very scary. Her mother had a right to be concerned when she didn't hear from her daughter. But in addition to Jessica, I did speak with one of Brandon's ex girlfriends who lived with him for over a year, beginning in 2022. Or beginning 2021 into 2022. And she described her time with him in an interview with me as just horrific. It was heartbreaking what she endured. In addition to being strangled repeatedly by Brandon Barnes, she said that they have two young children together, and he even at one point strangled their infant daughter when it was crying.
Unbelievable. Jen, these four people living together, obviously, one marriage, Brandon Barnes, Jessica Barnes, but what are the nature what was the nature of the relationships between everyone in that house?
So, a big question people are asking is how did Brandon Barnes come to live in South Carolina? He's originally from North Carolina. We are doing a deep dive into his background. But Kendall Mims, one of the women that was living with the four, they were living in the home of her grandfather. So they ended up in South Carolina to live in that pool house. Kendall was also has a baby with Brandon. And when Jessica met him, they met online. Cecilia, Jessica's mother, said that Brandon told Jessica that Kendall was his sister. So Jessica went into that relationship thinking Kendall was his sister, and he was just living with her, helping her out. I spoke with another ex girlfriend, Julia, of Brandon, who I'll be doing an interview with soon, who dated Brandon. She worked with him and dated him beginning August of 2023. And she said when she met him, she introduced Kendall as a sister and Jessica as his sister's best friend. And she said they would all hang out together. I mean, it was a very, very bizarre. So Julia said, in November, he was showing off ultrasound images of his baby with Kendall, and she realized that he had been lying to her and got out of the relationship, fortunately.
This guy has some, and we said the word earlier, Manson earlier in the lead to this, but this guy has some sort of hypnotic uh, power over these women. It seems that they believe the lies. He was apparently a bigamist at one point. He married one of the other women in this house. And then tell us about this Tippett, the third woman that's part of this
So
love quadrangle, rhombus, whatever we want to call it.
Right. So Julia said when she left broke off the relationship in November, Victoria was not a part of the picture. So she came in sometime after November. Not much is known about her, but according to Cecilia, that's kind of, things started shifting. And the indication that she gave me was that Jessica was upset when she realized that Brandon and Victoria were having a relationship, and that was towards the end of July. Victoria is the one of the two girls. She's the one who police say actually watched Brandon strangle Jessica to death. So yeah, I mean it's a really, really bizarre dynamic. For these two women living with him to cover up a horrific crime like that on his behalf. It's interesting.
When it's also important to point out, obviously, these are mere allegations, these charges against all three of these defendants, Brandon
Hmm.
Barnes, Kendall, and Victoria. These are charges. They're hasn't been adjudicated, but this is important to point out. They are based not only on overwhelming evidence obtained by investigators, but also confessions from not one, but from all three of those accused. So I do think it's important to point that out. None of the defendants in this case, at least not yet, are denying any of this. In fact, they've admitted their alleged roles in these crimes to investigators. We're referring to it as alleged, obviously, because it hasn't been, again, adjudicated. But, Jen, I do think it's important to note that there are confessions in this case from all three of the individuals involved, and certainly that's going to present a challenge for those defending them as this case moves forward. But Jen, you've done incredible work on this. I'm really looking forward to your next interview on it. For those of you who haven't seen the two interviews Jen Wood has done already, they are both up on FITSNews.com. Please go check those out. Interviews with both Jessica's mom and another one of the earlier girlfriends of Brandon Barnes, the accused murderer in this case. Jen, you've done amazing work on this story. Jen, before we go, though, I got to ask you real quick. We've had a flare up of some drama in this crazy John Paul Miller story. And I've just got to say something about this story and about the Micah Miller story, how far afield we have gone from the focus of this story, which is Micah Miller, the memory of Micah Miller, what happened to Micah Miller. This thing has turned into an absolute carnival, and there are no shortage of carnival barkers out there on this story. We saw some of that at work this week. Our Kelly Lyons filed two excellent reports this week trying to get to the bottom of an alleged TikTok fraud perpetrated purportedly by a woman out of Georgia related to a page that was auctioning items purportedly for the benefit of Micah's family. Apparently more than $15,000 was raised. The family only got $180 of it. But just in covering that simple spinoff of this story, I mean, people lost their minds while we're covering this story. Just a lot of rabbit holes that people have gone down. Jen, what do you make of it? I mean, has this thing gone off the rails similarly to how the Murdaugh case went off the rails?
It feels like it. You do a simple report on facts and you get accused of being on one side or the other. And, really, the only thing that matters is the truth and getting to what happened. You know, Micah Miller was a beautiful soul trying to get out of what appeared to be a very abusive relationship. And, the beginning of the story is trying to figure out, what happened. And it just keeps spiraling as, these TikTok accounts, pop up. And, I had interviewed one woman and was, just wasn't comfortable with the sourcing of her story, so held back. It told her
You
that.
know, you got attacked for that, and then we got
Yeah, I
attacked
mean, it's
this
just
week for
like,
being on JP's side, and it's just crazy.
right. It's just it's just, when you're truly just trying to give a voice to people, and get to the truth. It's very disheartening and disappointing. That $15,000 is allegedly gone from a fundraiser for Micah's family, and that's a problem. And it just, it's really interesting how these things seem to spiral into one team against the other.
Yeah, well, the truth doesn't have a team. That's one thing I've learned in this business. It just is what it is. It doesn't have a team. And so, Jen, I'm very appreciative of the way that you approach these stories and focusing on that as the North Star, not playing team sport with any of these stories. But as we look at this Micah Miller story, we are approaching some potentially decisive moments. We do hear that these civil cases that have been discussed extensively in the not too distant future, we could see a few of these start to finally drop. That will obviously be a big moment in the evolution of this story because we will start to see uh, in firsthand accounts, filed complaints, more than likely, stories of some of these victims, alleged victims of John Paul Miller, and also perhaps we've reported on his father, who is said to have been part of some of this uh, reprehensibly hypocritical behavior. We've been told he's part of this civil saga, so we're going to be on the lookout for that. Obviously, don't know all the details yet of what course that will take. Then there's the criminal investigation. John Paul Miller still very much at the heart of a criminal inquiry led by the federal authorities here in South Carolina. And then last but not least, Jen, the broader debate, the debate that doesn't just involve Micah Miller, but involves everyone in the Palmetto State who's in a relationship, coercive control. What is the South Carolina legislature going to do as it relates to that issue? Because that, to me anyway, is the largest of these narratives because it impacts so many people beyond Micah Miller, J.P. Miller. And in fact, Jen, as we've covered some of these other stories, we've seen the issue of coercive control crop up. And in fact, Brandon, we were just talking about it earlier, Brandon Barnes, one of the things he did was isolate Jessica Barnes from her family, cut her off from potential support, cut her off from people that she could report things to. So we're going to see a lot of these things in the cases that we cover. So that to me is the biggest part of the Micah story. But God, it's depressing to see these stories go off the rails like this with these carnival barkers and opportunistic lawyers and just hackery everywhere.
Yeah, it is. It's very hard to watch because, and I do think, in tragedy, so much good can come out of it, if you focus on the truth. And I just feel like a lot of times lately, it's just that's not what people care about.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You look at both of these stories, it's kind of, you can draw some parallels, the Murdochs and the Millers. When did the nuts start coming out? Well, it's when certain people started focusing on the cases. But anyway, I won't go there. Jen, you've done amazing work on this story. Keep us in the loop, not only on what's happening with the Micah case as we await these potential civil filings, the criminal investigation, and as we approach the upcoming legislative session, as lawmakers look at coercive control. Jen, I know you'll keep us in the loop on all three of those. And also, please, if you haven't read the story of Jessica Barnes, just heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking, go to FITSNews.com and check that story out. But Jen, thank you so much for all your work on these stories.
Thanks for having me.
So we are 24 days, less than 4 weeks away from the end of one of the craziest election cycles in American history, one with indictments, convictions, multiple assassination attempts. Dylan Nolan, this has been a wild ride. We're coming to the end of it. We're starting to see these polls, undecided voters starting to make their minds up a little bit. Let me ask you a point-blank question, though. I want to start with the polling in the swing state of North Carolina, a very close race. I was talking with Andy Fancher earlier about some of the suppression of the death totals from Hurricane Helene. Do you think this is deliberate? Do you think there's a political motivation there? Do you think that Democrats are trying to minimize damage to Kamala Harris in North Carolina?
I mean, we've certainly seen a lot of what looks like mainstream media running cover for Democrats on a number of issues. I can't say definitively that that's what's happening here. The charitable explanation would be that they haven't confirmed that these people are dead. But also, when you see a death toll after an event like this, that, as Andrew correctly said, is a mass casualty event, when you see it pause for days and days, when you know that there are first responders who are recovering bodies day and night, that certainly should be something that we question. And to the political implications, look at Barack Obama's campaign in 2012 when Hurricane Sandy hit parts of the Northeast very hard. And I think it was a successful response to that, which propelled Obama's candidacy to success.
Mm-hmm. So, botched response, damage control, successful response back in 2012.
Amplification.
Right. So, North Carolina, obviously one of the many states in play. The others, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada. We're looking at least 7 battleground states that are very much within the margin of error right now if you look at most of these polls. But I want to ask you a question. These races are nip and tuck. In fact, Donald Trump, some would argue in the last couple of days, particularly, perhaps taking a slight lead in most of these swing states. But let me ask you a key question. Trump has historically outperformed polls. He did it in 2016 against Hillary Clinton, did it to an even greater extent, although not quite enough, against Joe Biden 4 years ago. If Trump is even remotely close to outperforming the polls this cycle, what are we going to see in the Electoral College?
I mean, first of all, if Trump does not outperform the polls right now, he would win the Electoral College. If he outperforms the polls at all, he will still win the Electoral College. There are 7 swing states, and he is currently favored in 6 of the 7. And he is favored in the most crucial state, which is Pennsylvania. He could win the election just based off of the East Coast states if he wins Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia.
Yeah, if those 3 fall for him, it's over.
Yes,
It's over. There's no path for Kamala Harris, correct?
indeed.
Okay. How likely is that to happen in your mind at this point?
You know, I'm looking at the same public data as everybody else, but what's interesting is it seems as though the operatives running Kamala Harris's campaign consider it to be a distinct possibility, as her initial strategy was to avoid doing a lot of media. But this week, we've seen she's gone on an all-out media blitz. She did appearances on The View, on the podcast Call Her Daddy. She went on the Stephen Colbert Show. So she's been spending a lot more time in front of cameras than she has to this point in the campaign. She also went on 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes took a big hit on their credibility this week when she completely word salad flubbed an answer about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and they released the original answer somewhere on social media on an extended cut. I'm not sure where, but on the official broadcast version, they either recut the question or cut an answer from a different question, which didn't make air in where she sounded better. And, you know, if you're a Democrat and you can't knock a 60 Minutes interview out of the park, you're in deep trouble.
Well, and also, I mean, what does that say about the integrity of those outlets?
Well, I mean, 60 Minutes was the outlet which famously debated Donald Trump about the veracity of the Hunter Biden laptop story before the last election. Their hosts doing that, you know, live when they're interviewing the president. And look how that panned out. The laptop has been admitted into evidence in court by federal prosecutors of Joe Biden's administration. It's not disputed at all. So to folks that think that they still have credibility, they're mentally in the Walter Cronkite era still.
Yeah, it's interesting to see because we heard, and I want to go back just 40 days ago, Facebook Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg writes this letter to Jim Jordan, one of the Republican leaders in the House of Representatives, admitting that his platform was an active participant in that censorship industrial complex Andy was talking about in the run-up to the 2020 election. Zuckerberg apologizing, promising to do better, and yet now here they are throttling stories that get to the real elevated death toll in the Appalachians.
Yeah, Mark Zuckerberg, you know, he used to be a complete nerd, looked like he'd never seen the sun. Now he does Brazilian jiu-jitsu, surfs, and has a perm, so people think he's cool. But he's much like the abusive spouse who beats their wife and then apologizes and then beats her the next day. Because while he's apologized because he realizes that he's going to get pantsed if Republicans take power in D.C., he's still doing the crime. He's still doing it.
Yeah. Let me ask you this: all the manipulation, all the money, all the media blitz. Obviously, Kamala Harris much more in the bank than Trump, dropping it heavily right now. You talked about that media tour; they are spending massive
Paid media, as you call it, advertising.
massive paid media in those key swing states. Are you surprised it isn't moving the needle?
You know, I think I said something like this months ago, which is that no debate, no amount of paid media is going to change the fact that people remember what gasoline cost, what groceries cost. You know, you look at the last debate, we had questions about climate change, we had questions about social justice, but the economy is first and foremost, and that's not something that the debate moderators seem to want to bring up. But that's what most voters are primarily concerned about.
Mm-hmm. As these undecideds start to break in these swing states, obviously we've seen economic concerns, immigration at the very top of the list of these undecided voters. I want to ask you 2 questions. First, from the perspective of Kamala Harris's campaign. If you were in charge of her campaign right now, what are you telling her to focus on over the next nearly 4 weeks?
You know, I don't think the people that are in charge of her campaign are actually pursuing an ineffective strategy. I just think that they've got somebody at the front of the campaign who's not able to execute it well. I mean, if I were running Kamala's campaign, I would tell them to do exactly what they're doing, which is completely lie about your policies. You know, it's hilarious because in 2019, she ran on mandatory gun buybacks, i.e. gun confiscations, and now she's talking about how, like me, she loves Glocks. You know, I don't know that she's ever done what I just did, which was hold a Glock, but she's at least going in public and saying that she does, and she's drinking the champagne of beers. You know, I drink the champagne of beers, and she knows that she's down with male voters in general, so she's making that appeal. I think that's intelligent. I just don't know that the numbers are showing that it's enough.
Well, before I ask you the same question about Trump's campaign managers, let me ask you this: did you see it coming? This bizarre sort of trolling by Joe Biden of his own vice president, really highlighting this rift between the two of them. Have you been
Did you
following?
see it coming? I mean, anybody that's been paying attention to politics knows that Joe Biden hates Kamala Harris. Let's throw it back to the debate stage where she ripped him as being a racist, segregationist, sexist piece of shit. I mean, how would he like her? But the reality of the Democrat Party is that he had to make the promise to put a black woman on the ticket, and apparently they couldn't find anybody more competent in the whole country, so it was her. But he's never stopped hating her. Why would he? Evidence of that was made very clear when he made her the border czar, the worst issue for them. He put her in charge of it because he didn't want to deal with it, and he wanted her to have to deal with an issue that would perpetually make her look bad.
Drag her down.
Yes,
Absolutely.
and that's exactly what it's done. He
Well,
hamstrung her. Anybody who saw that understood exactly how the Bidens feel. So how they've been acting recently shouldn't be surprising.
Well, you just said the key term there, the Bidens. It was Jill Biden that was adamant, even when the DNC made it clear it was an ultimatum. Jill Biden still urged her husband not to put Kamala Harris on the ticket.
Indeed, she did. And, you know, some people have been calling what we've seen this week the revenge of Jill.
Well, let me ask you this. Will it have any impact? Biden upstaging Kamala's Michigan rally, linking her, said her and her staff and his staff were interlocked on all the major policy initiatives. Does it do anything to move the voters?
You know, it's interesting because perhaps Biden saying, oh, Kamala and I are moving lockstep would be important if she were effectively distancing herself. But like I say, there's a reason that she hasn't been going in front of the cameras. When she went on The View this week, they gave her the absolute softball of asking her if there was a policy, anything that she would have done different than Joe Biden. And she said that, one, she couldn't think of anything she would have done differently, and two, that she was in the room when all the major decisions were made. Now, she doesn't have to be rude and throw him completely under the bus to say, look, the withdrawal from Afghanistan that resulted in the death of 13 American soldiers and turned over the Bagram Air Base to the Taliban and resulted in the complete collapse of the country in a matter of days, I would have done that differently.
Yeah.
Or to say that I'm going to pursue a different set of economic policies. You don't even have to be specific. Just say you're going to pursue something different because everybody knows that what's happening right now is not working.
Yeah. So let me go back to the question I asked you earlier about what you would do if you were at the helm of Kamala's campaign organization. Obviously, you mentioned there were some issues with the top of the ticket. There's probably some issues with the top of the ticket on the Republican side as far as following the advice of advisors and pollsters. But let me ask you this. If you're advising Trump over the next 24 days, what are you telling him to do?
It's interesting you talk about not taking advice. He's going to be holding a rally in Coachella, California. This is something I see him being panned for. I don't, you know, obviously the effect of rallies on the ground, you can look back to races that have been narrowly lost. For example, Hillary Clinton probably wishes she put some more ground game in the blue wall where she never put any ground game and then lost. It will be interesting to see if history records Trump's rallies in Coachella. He's going to do another one in November, really close to Election Day at Madison Square Garden. In the states that he's not projected to win, California has no chance. New York, he's actually made significant inroads, but he's still not going to win the state. It's going to be interesting to see if that is remembered as a success or a failure.
So why go?
Why go? I think the argument is to show that he's not forgotten about these places, and also because we live in the era of mass media. You know, most of the people that are consuming a rally aren't consuming it while they're there. Mm-hmm. But I think one could argue that's a mistake. I don't know. I don't know whether it's going to be viewed in the long run of history as a good move or a bad move, and whether future campaigns will seek to emulate what he's doing here. It's certainly interesting, though. You talk about Trump going off message, and I think he did this a lot in 2016, 2015 candidacy. He did it a lot throughout his presidency. But I think one of the defining characteristics of this campaign has been how few times he's gone off message. I think in the debate, he obviously got frustrated and totally took the bait. I think when he went to Georgia and started beefing with the Republican governor of Georgia for no reason. I mean, I understand what motivates him, but it's just not what you do in an election year. You know, he's gone off script a couple of times, but from a guy who used to shoot himself in the foot like twice a day, doing it twice in the campaign really isn't so bad.
Yeah, by Trump standards, this has been a very
This has been very clean. By the
Right.
standards of your normal polished politician, it hasn't been, but those people are not real people.
Yeah. One last question for you, Dylan, as you look at the next 24 days of this election cycle. You've called it on several times in this show, concerns about attempts on Trump's life over the next 3.5+ weeks. If these numbers keep moving the way they're moving, if these advantages, narrow advantages that Trump has opened up in the swing states, which we have to assume are going to be bolstered by his historical outperforming of polls, is that something that concerns you over the next 3.5 weeks?
Attempt on his life is certainly concerning. I think if Trump goes down, Vance will still stand a good chance of winning the election, perhaps a better chance if Trump goes down. And I think that Vance he demonstrated in that vice presidential debate that, man, I think he would be just as big of a problem for Democrats in the White House as Trump, perhaps even more. I think he's got some IQ on Trump for sure. One thing that, more so than Trump going down, which I think should be a concern to people who support him, is the prospect of a Russian or Iranian or whoever, the foreign actor is shutting off our power grid on election day. I think if it looks bad enough, we could see some sort of horrific third-party event, a la COVID, something that looks like an act of God, which we won't be able to discern until, the dust has settled what exactly has happened. But I would encourage those who want to make sure that their votes are counted. If your state has early voting, early in-person voting, I would say go and get your vote banked before Election Day if it's possible.
Sage advice. Well, also for those of you who want to follow the insanity of this election cycle as it reaches its crescendo, we will be hosting a live show election night. You can follow the returns. We'll be providing commentary. We'll have guests. Dylan and I are going to be hosting that show. Really excited. Our first ever live election show. We've done live blogs before on election night, but this is the first night we'll be on the air. So obviously, you want to track the returns. You want to hear the analysis of how the election's going, how the race is going. We'll also be covering some races here in South Carolina. We'll be updating Senate races across the state, across the country. So make plans to tune in to FITSNews.com on election night for our live election coverage. That is a wrap for this week's edition of Your Week in Review. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thanks to everyone supporting our work over at FITSNews.com. If you haven't already, it's only $8 a month. Your subscription empowers everything that we do here, all the accountability we're trying to achieve, and all these stories that we cover. I do want to send a quick shout out to our friends at the South Carolina Election Commission. We mentioned earlier, just 24 days until the big election. You've got until October 14 to register to vote, so hurry up if you're in South Carolina. Go ahead, get registered. But our friends at scvotes.gov, they've got you covered. Also want to thank our good friend Victoria Smith, Victoria's Verdict. Our verdict is if you're in trouble in the Low Country, if you've been in a wreck in the Low Country, look up Victoria Smith. She's the one you need to reach out to. We will catch you next time on the Week in Review as we dive deeper into the Appalachian apocalypse and update you on all the true crime and political stories that we're covering here at FITSNews.com.